Welcome to Kitchen Sink Dharma. So we live in an incredible time because we have access to more information than anybody's ever had before. And it's a real time of cross-pollination of ideas, and that includes ideas about how to live in this world. So if you're a spiritual seeker, there's no shortage of traditions out there from which you can choose your path. There's many rich seams for you to mine. And of course there's a lot of interaction between different spiritual traditions, and that includes various different schools of Buddhism. So ideas are just bumping into each other in ways that have never been possible before, never would have happened until recently. And as Buddhist teachings have spread across the West, particularly in the last 50 years or so, we've added our own perspectives. We've added perspectives from psychology, from psychotherapy. Also, liberal values have come into it. And of course, modern science is getting in on the act, because there's a whole expanding body of research out there that supports all of this ancient wisdom. So the world's always been quite porous, ideas have always travelled around. But the whole exchange of ideas that's really been energized by modern travel and by communications, by the internet, is incredible. One of the things that this means is that most of us have access to a whole bewildering choice of teachers and schools. And I think that's mostly a good thing, even though it can be a bit baffling sometimes. So when I first gave up full-time work and went looking for some spiritual guidance, I spent some time in a number of different centres. I went to a Theravadan monastery. I stayed in several Tibetan centres. I did a weekend retreat in a Zen monastery. Spent a load of time in an ashram in India, in Rishikesh, and then started doing Vipassana retreats. And I enjoyed all of it. I enjoyed staying in all these different places. I benefited a lot from all the different traditions, all the wisdom that I encountered. But I think more importantly, I also figured out what works for me, what was right for me to do. Because I think at some point, if you're really going to start practicing seriously, you have to stop window shopping. You have to maybe start to engage with one particular practice or another. So for me, since then, I've mostly been taught in Western settings. I like Gaia House in Devon, teach in the Insight meditation tradition. And that's the basis of my own path and my practice. It's based on early Buddhist teachings. And my particular approach is quite non-religious. I'm concerned with the reduction of suffering and misery in this lifetime, and I'm not so interested in looking for a better rebirth or making merit or anything that requires any metaphysical beliefs. I'm much more concerned with just how to live in this world in this lifetime. Now, if your own path is something very different from that, that's absolutely fine, and there are all sorts of different traditions, different teachings that lead to awakening. And I don't know whether one is necessarily better than another, but I think it's probably a case of different teachings, different approaches suit different temperaments. So if you listen to this podcast, please take whatever it is that you find helpful here and discard anything that you don't find helpful, just get rid of the rest of it. Because for me, this is something I'm interested in, what's useful. So what the Buddha taught was mindfulness and kindness and compassion and wisdom and so on, and it was very much about ethics. He taught about living an ethical life. And I think that's the really useful bit that any of us can apply to our lives. But since the time of the Buddha, there's been all sorts of competing schools and doctrines that have emerged. And sometimes, this has added a lot of practical techniques. It's added a lot of new ways of understanding the teachings. And some of the perspectives are really beneficial. Different ways of looking at suffering and the end of suffering. But I think it also gives people an excuse to argue about why their particular version is better. And I don't think that's particularly helpful. So when we take any teachings to be a statement of absolute truth, or when you get a teacher that says, this is exactly how the Buddha taught, or if teachings are described as being the only true teachings, the only real way to liberation, I think that's just us closing our minds. We're just really closing our minds and squaring up for an argument. So I think it's much more helpful to view the teachings that we encounter as strategies or as tools maybe. So Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana, Vajrayana, non-dual spirituality, Sufi, Christian mysticism, there's a whole list that I think are skillful means that can help to liberate us if we apply them. And I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that all spiritual and mystical traditions point to exactly the same truth. But I think there is a lot of common ground in where it is they're pointing us. So I think it's, one common theme, I think, is a sense of being part of something bigger and of having a connection to other beings, and a bit of a movement away from the sense of separateness, from the sense of just thinking of ourselves. I think most spiritual traditions take us away from our tight preoccupation with our own egos, with our own fragile egos, and they move us away from grasping and clinging, and away from materialism, away from greed, and they move us towards generosity and renunciation. I think there's always an ethical dimension to any religion or any spiritual practice, as well as maybe a set of techniques. So within Buddhism, you'll find very different approaches in a Tibetan monastery or a Zen abbey, or maybe a secular retreat centre. But I think you'll also find a great deal in common. You'll find mindfulness and kindness and compassion and wisdom are common themes. So when you focus too much on doctrinal differences, I think that causes us to close down, it makes us put up barriers. And if we just put our energies into arguing why one doctrine is better than the other, we lose something that's really important. And there's a concept that's taught within Zen called beginner's mind, and to me that conveys a kind of openness, a receptiveness, maybe a willingness to say, yeah, I'm a learner, I don't have all the answers. So I think it's not about discarding opinions entirely, but it's maybe about holding them a bit less tightly. And I think it still matters very much what you believe and which teacher you listen to. I think there's really an important role for discernment here. We need to be able to figure out what's going to help us and what's going to potentially harm us. And we know that there are lots of dangerous and abusive teachers out there. There's cults, there's financial scams. So we do have to be able to make a good choice if we're going to follow a particular path. And there's advice from the Buddha about choosing a teacher, and there's a sutta called the Kalama Sutta. And he said, don't go on what you've heard repeatedly, don't go on tradition, don't rely on rumour, don't rely on something just because it's in a scripture, don't rely on anything or anybody because they sound good. And he went through a load of reasons, 10 reasons I think it was, not to follow a teacher. He said basically, don't neglect your own intelligence, your own wisdom. Don't follow someone just because they're charismatic. He said, when you know something leads to blamelessness, that a wise person would support it, that it brings about happiness rather than causing suffering, that's when to believe it. So, although an awful lot of what the Buddha taught, I think, is open to interpretation, most of what he taught was quite straightforward. It's quite simple. It's not all glamorous or dramatic, it's often quite subtle, but it's not necessarily all that complicated. And he set out guidance showing how his followers should behave and ensuring that they looked after each other. And he encouraged his communities to become self-regulating, and where people looked after each other, where the young and the old were looked after. And he was very much against any kind of rituals or any adherence to any ceremonies or anything. And he actually discouraged any philosophical debate that wasn't directly relevant to awakening and the removal of suffering. And first and foremost, he taught his followers to pay careful attention to their experience of reality, to notice what reality was like for them, to notice the physical sensations, the feelings, the moods, the thought patterns that arise in every moment. And if you read the early suttas, you can see what he taught was very practical, was very doable. And I personally don't see any reason to complicate those teachings. So the 3 core elements of ethical behaviour, training the mind, and developing wisdom, I think they're actually challenging enough. If we're able to employ these trainings and face up to our tendencies of greed and hatred and delusion, if we can work with those tendencies and take away their power over us, then I think we're doing all right. We're practicing a spiritual path that's going to benefit us and benefit other people. Now, the first longer retreat I did was with Goenkaji, with Esen Goenka. These are 10-day Vipassana retreats. And there's one of the teaching stories of his that always stayed with me. He talks about a man becoming sick and going to the doctor for help. And the doctor examines him and writes out a prescription. The man's got a lot of faith in his doctor. So he goes home and he puts a beautiful picture of the doctor in his prayer room, and 3 times a day he bows down to the picture. And then he takes out the prescription and he recites it. And he shouts out 2 pills in the morning, 2 pills in the afternoon, 2 pills in the evening. And he keeps reciting the prescription because he's got great faith in the doctor. But of course, just reciting the prescription doesn't help him. He decides that he wants to know more about this prescription. And so he asks his doctor, why did you prescribe this medicine? How's it going to help me? And the doctor explains, well, look, this is your disease. This is the root cause of your disease. If you take the medicine I prescribed, it's going to eradicate your disease. And the man thinks, that's wonderful. My doctor's so intelligent. His prescriptions are so helpful. And he goes home and he starts fighting with his neighbours and his acquaintances. And he keeps battling them, insisting, my doctor's the best doctor. All the other doctors are useless. And all his life he just keeps fighting and arguing. But still, it doesn't actually help him at all because he doesn't take the medicine. It's only if he takes the medicine he's going to be relieved of his misery and his disease, and that's only by doing that is it going to help him. And I love this story because I think every spiritual tradition offers a prescription, and it's very much up to us whether we want to make use of it or turn it into a reason for fighting other people and arguing with other people. So if we practice meditation, if we have a path and we're trying to cultivate calm and insight and kindness and compassion, these are not alternative paths. They're all part of one path. The Buddha didn't actually teach a number of separate systems. He gave us one meditation path, one set of tools for freeing ourselves from suffering, one prescription, if you like. And then different elements of that might be given more emphasis depending where you go or depending who's teaching you. Any of those things can become your primary practice. And it's really important to acknowledge that over the centuries, there's other approaches, other practices have been added in, they've been created, and there's other wonderful teachers who have added different techniques and tools that are available to us. And we're fortunate to have that choice, to be in a position to work out what works for us. But to me, this calls for a spirit of inquiry. It calls for some beginner's mind. And personally, I don't see any need to turn any teacher into an object of worship. And I think there's not enough time in the day for arguments about doctrine. I mean, instead, let's just cultivate the art of meditation. Let's just concentrate on learning how to engage fully with the world, where everything's right here, in the body and the senses, in our whole experience. And it's not in some distant land, but it's right here in front of us. It's there. It offers to teach us everything that we need to know. So thank you again for listening to Kitchen Sink Dharma. Hope you can join me again soon.